Hello, and welcome back to our little anime lit club. Today, we're going to discuss the first 5 chapters of Tsukimichi Moonlit Fantasy. Lately, I've been having a lot of fun by sort of sampling different manga, and I feel like 5 chapters is sort of the sweet spot for getting into the story enough without hitting that sort of point of no return. So, yeah, I kind of just wanted to talk about my thoughts on this one. So, it will have spoilers for those first 5 chapters, but nothing beyond that. In addition to that, I will be making some comparisons between Moonlit Fantasy and That Time I Got Reincarnated as a Slime, but I'll mostly just be talking about the opening of the other story, so just keep that in mind. So, where to start with this one? Well, I guess the best place to start would actually be with the comparison I just mentioned. So, one area of concern for me is that the story so far is actually pretty similar to That Time I Got Reincarnated as a Slime. Both start with an overpowered hero being lost in a new fantasy world, then meeting and saving a sort of orc slash goblin village, and then also making friends with one of the most powerful dragons of all time. That being said, there is still enough to differentiate the two. For example, this one starts off with the hero being magically teleported to the fantasy world rather than explicitly dying. It kind of feels like he'll be considered dead by his previous world, but it's still handled very differently. Then you have the subversion that he was supposed to be this grand hero, but he was rejected by the goddess. And, in That Time I Got Reincarnated as a Slime, he sort of just reincarnated as a slime and accidentally happens to become very powerful. Also, in this one, his dragon friend is a girl, and she doesn't seem to have the same sort of political importance as Veldora. Veldora is sort of treated as this political anchor that keeps all of these kingdoms in check, and so far, the dragon in this one doesn't seem to have that same level of influence, but beyond that, one of the biggest differences is that the hero retains his appearance, identity, skills, etc. In That Time I Got Reincarnated as a Slime, the hero, as you can probably guess, is reincarnated as a slime. As a result, he has to adjust to being in a completely different body and having a different sort of sense of self. In this one, however, Makoto is still himself and still has skills from his past life, like his archery skills. So, really, all of that is to say that I'm pretty interested in seeing where this series goes. I'm curious to see if the similarities will stop in the near future or if there will be interesting parallels between these stories as the series goes on. But that being said, I want to talk about some of the things that I just want to specifically praise about this series in particular. So, my immediate reaction is that I love the artwork, the humor, and the world building. The artwork in this manga is really well done, and each panel feels like a screenshot from a full produced anime rather than just a storyboard, for example. To be fair, manga art tends to be really good, but some manga are forced to cut corners, etc., due to budget or time or something like that. But this one feels really well drawn and well detailed. I also really like the art style and the anatomy style in this one. It's very clean visually, and characters like Emma still read as being kind of cute and adorable, even when she's an orc and not humanoid, if that makes sense. I also really enjoy the humor in this one. After seeing a couple of isekai fantasy like That Time I Got Reincarnated as a Slime, I've been killing slimes for 300 years and maxed out my level, and solo leveling if you count that one, I don't think I've ever seen the hero get rejected from their role as the hero for being too ugly. It has a good balance between earnest storytelling and absurd humor. For example, I was genuinely engaged in the dragon fight and worried about the orc village, even though there was a ton of humor at the start of the story. Furthermore, there have even been some interesting moments where a character will misspeak or mispronounce something and then acknowledge it, which is kind of a niche sense of humor, but I always appreciate it. it weirdly adds this level of realism to the dialogue and also breaks up the flow of the reading since you'll stop and be like, wait, was that a typo? And then the character will acknowledge that they mixed up their words. And that sort of play with the process of reading and the audience and the sort of condition of being a reader is just always really fun. The world building in this one is also really interesting so far. I feel like the anime slash manga genre of fantasy is quickly becoming one of my favorite types of fantasy since it incorporates some interesting video game elements into their worlds. Since most of my exposure to fantasy is through video games like Skyrim, there's an interesting meta context where I daydream about fantasy through the perspective of video games, intentional or not, which means that these anime fantasy worlds are actually pretty accurate to that daydreamed concept. Like, when I daydream about what it would be like to live in Skyrim, I sort of unintentionally incorporate the video game aspects into that daydream as well. Like, if you play Skyrim and you're playing as a wizard, when you cast a spell, you have to monitor that blue mana bar. As a result, it's hard to imagine what it would be like to cast a spell in Skyrim without also considering that sort of draw on your mana slash magicka slash like magic energy. So, all of that is to basically say that these worlds feel both familiar and like they would be fun and playful to exist and explore within. Like, I want to explore and try out their systems, and that means that getting isekai'd into one of them would actually be a pretty fun experience. So far, I also really appreciate how the gods feel like ancient, kind of almost Greek gods. They are all powerful, a bit flippant, and oddly mysterious and incomprehensible. Tsukuyomi specifically seems really cool, and I hope that he isn't being secretly deceptive. He almost seems like he's too good to be true, so I'm a bit suspicious of him, but at the same time, I don't want to be since he seems like he's a bro, if that makes sense. As for the world building, I also really like that Makoto's parents are actually from this magical world. It kind of reminds me of the beginning of the Masters of the Universe movie, but I won't be getting into that movie anymore because I don't want to get into spoilers. Beyond that, I also thought it was a really cool detail how the Earth is sort of hostile to magic. So Makoto was basically accidentally strengthening himself the entire time he was on Earth since he is biologically from a magical world. At first, I thought it was a bit of a cop out that's like, oh, you're actually so powerful because you lived on Earth. But when you realize that Makoto biologically is, basically a fantasy creature because his parents aren't from Earth, so he's not in that way from Earth. It makes more sense and it's actually pretty cool. And speaking of magic, so far I really like this sort of magical spells and the magical system. They kind of remind me of the conjuration magic from Skyrim, and I feel like one of my favorite conjuration spells has always been summoning the bow and arrow, and so seeing Makoto do something similar was really cool. And speaking of archery, I really appreciate how Makoto actually has skills from his time on Earth that actually apply to a fantasy world. Usually the hero will have some sort of like background knowledge that ends up being helpful, like they'll know about architecture or cooking or medicine or something like that. But this is one of the first ones I've seen where they have prior combat skill, like knowledge and experience. So it's cool because it makes him feel like a bit more of a compelling hero, in my opinion, since some of his sort of power and power ranking and combat ability feels more earned since he already has that prior skill that he's worked really hard on and practiced a ton. But yeah, with that, I think I'm going to wrap up today's little review of Moonlit Fantasy. I'm pretty interested in seeing where this one goes since right now it kind of feels like it could go anywhere. I was a bit confused by one of the flashbacks they showed about his relationship with his sort of like the leader of the archery club, but I'm assuming that girl is going to be one of the other prospective heroes that's come to this magical world, but we'll just have to wait and see. But Yeah, I'm enjoying this one so far, so I do think I'll continue reading it. So, if you want to be notified when the next episode goes up, please consider subscribing to the channel. Also, if you enjoyed today's video, please consider giving it a like, it helps a ton. But with that being said, I'm going to sign off now, so take care, and I will see you in the next one.